Welcome to the Pulling the Threads podcast, where we, explore the histories, mysteries, and go into textual criticism and the historical critical method. And we take a look at ancient sacred text. Today, I have with me James Valliant, author of Creating Christ, who this is a second interview. So we're doing a bit of a follow up today. I would just like to go ahead and start by asking you, since our last interview, what new projects or things have you been working on?
Oh, my golly, I've been working on various things, um, updating my opinions on things, strengthening them, if anything, with changes in scholarship when it relates to creating Christ, but all kinds of other things. Let me just put it that way. I'm involved in all kinds of other activities in my life right now, and we'll just leave it there because they're not directly related to what we're talking about.
Makes sense, yeah. Well, that actually goes into my first actual question. Is my first question for you before getting into some of the things where I want to talk about the physical evidence that we have. Most of my theories go with physical evidence found, not theories of when it was written. But as far as your thesis in creating Christ, in what ways, if you were able to update that now, would you update your thesis, or what ideas have you, based on what you said, the updates in scholarship, what new directions or what changes would you make to that?
Well, I think, in creating Christ, gave the very standard answer about the dating of the Pauline epistles. And I'm not confident in that anymore. I'd always thought that elements of, say, First and Second Corinthians and Galatians, for example, ju- uh, w- uh, Philippians in particular, just don't fit with a mid first century dating. I suspect that much of what we call the canonical Pauline corpus is actually post war. I think that there are references, for example, to the temple that are hard to explain except in a context where the temple has been destroyed. In Corinthians, Paul, for example, tells us, we Christians are the church. We are the temple. Jesus is our cornerstone, and it's better. Why is it better? Because these temples made with material objects are subject to the flames, subject to destruction, and that seems to me to be hard to understand. First of all, why would we need a temple substitute? Let's say you're a Pharisee in the first century who believes in resurrection. We have a redemptive mechanism. That redemptive mechanism is the temple. Yom Kippur, when the high priest enters the Holy of Holies and implores God for the forgiveness of the sins of the people, animal sacrifices and the like. Or if you're an Essene, let's see, before the war, we have our own redemptive mechanism, perhaps something like John the Baptist's baptism through, for remission of sins. So why do we need now? And although baptism is incorporated, and although the temple is symbolically incorporated into Pauline thought, Christian thought in general, why need a new redemptive mechanism in the death and resurrection of Jesus? This goes beyond merely his followers, his early followers, having, say, visions of the risen Christ. Paul gives metaphysical significance to the death and resurrection of Jesus in a way that says we don't need that darn temple anymore. And so the very need, and Paul describes himself as a Pharisee. If that's the case, sir, why then do we need a new? Why would we need a new temple? We got the temple, and it's our redemptive mechanism. So I'm inclined now to put the Pauline corpus in a post-war environment. That's one thing. Also, in creating Christ, we like again the standard view has long been that the testimonium in the Antiquities of Josephus has been tampered with, and we took that view that, my gosh, even whatever Josephus's view, such a fulsome sort of endorsement of Christianity is unlikely to have come from the hands of someone writing to a general audience as a historian. I'm not so sure anymore. The work of Samuel Zinner and other scholars have actually convinced me that the text can be read either neutrally or negatively. It doesn't have to be read in the positive, uh, fulsome way that causes many scholars and has caused many scholars to be skeptical of it. He's joined recently by Goldberg, a major Josephus scholar, and they have caused me to rethink that. I think that most, if not all, of the testimonium is actually correct. I know our manuscripts are late, but they've all got something in there. And besides the James passage, for which also in the Antiquities, really wouldn't make sense if there wasn't some other reference to Jesus. Now, we'd made that argument, and we did believe there was some other statement about Jesus just to make sense out of the James passage, but I see absolutely no reason, despite the claims of some, that the James passage is also an interpolation. Also interesting is speaking of physical evidence, is the recent archaeological find, and it is relatively recent, of a Jesus is God in laid out in a nice, lovely Roman mosaic dating from the early 3rd century. And that appears to be our first, the earliest reference to Jesus as
What's
God,
the date on that?
around 220 is so early 3rd century.
Mm.
And it is in the Holy Land, but it's also associated with a Roman military camp, which is exceedingly fascinating in light of our thesis. There is evidence that there were large numbers of Christians in the Roman army by the end of the 2nd century. There are stories about, of course, their involvement in an important battle that was done under Marcus Aurelius. And the battle itself is, of course, commemorated in the column of Marcus Aurelius, which dates from the late 2nd century. So if that's true, that is also a fascinating thing. Pliny the Younger, in his famous correspondence with Trajan about what shall we do with these Christians, when he was governor of Bithynia, he's corresponding with the Emperor Trajan. And this is around the year 111 of the Common Era. He lays out a procedure that he's been using. If they're willing to make prayers in front of our state gods and the images of our gods, then that seems to be a test. But between the two great Jewish wars, of course, the Roman government is anxious to separate out the dangerous rebel Jewish messianics from those who might believe in a Jewish Messiah but are comparatively safe. And for anyone to belong to the Roman army, they would surely have had to pass Pliny's test and still be Christian. And so finding this new archaeological evidence in association with a Roman military camp by 220 AD is absolutely fascinating to me. So we have in a pre-Constantine context another association, if you will, between the Roman military and Christians being in that Roman military. Certainly at least Roman toleration of the idea, which is absolutely fascinating to me, because to join the Roman army, you'd have to take all kinds of oaths under these standards, these Roman eagles, which undoubtedly to a Torah Orthodox Jew would be a graven image, and anything like that would be a violation of a Torah orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so those are, I guess, some substantial changes there. When you look at the time period, you mentioned the two Jewish Roman wars, and I think that those are very important to understanding the text. Now, I know that our standard theories go based upon the language that we have within the text, of the dating of the Gospels and epistles. I fully, tacitly reject those ideas because I focus on when we find the physical evidence, and it's theoretical. Now, standard theories, majority of people accept them. That's great and fascinating. And it is true to look at within the language, like, does this match the language of the period they say they're writing from? But it's also something somebody could try to fabricate after fact, based on, understanding language of the time.
What
So
thou
for
art
me,
thou, what thou
huh?
art thee talking about?
Huh?
What
Was it?
thou art thee talking about?
Yeah,
I
yes.
can imitate old English language, or if I use the word groovy, you kind of know, well, wait a minute, you couldn't have been written before the 1960s because, if I'm feeling groovy, to quote the song, they would have no meaning in English before that. So we can, in some ways, use the language, but you're absolutely right. As I just showed, people can make their language archaic on
Mm.
purpose to make it sound older.
Yes, so if it's a pre-existing language, then you can go back to it. But if it's something that pops up as a new, like kids nowadays like to say things like skibbity and riz and these words that have no previous,
And I'm down with
um, yeah, yeah.
that.
So I mean, if somebody says, skibbity or riz, then you that's a definite marker that kind of that fall it moves. Groovy is a word that it may have been, that pre-existed, but not like it was used then, or at least comes from groove, groovy.
If you mean
It kind of
groove,
comes from the language, but skibbity, I mean, what linguistic basis is that? And I know I'm going off on a tangent. Maybe some of the younger listeners will appreciate that, or parents. Um, but yeah, so I don't follow that. I don't accept it. I mean, it's a good theory. And so for me, it's the first physical evidence, first copies we got. Um, now, I'm not going to go that direction yet. You mentioned the two Jewish Roman wars. And for me, I place the early Jesus, James, Essene, Ebionite group, the earliest Jewish Christians, as we would call them now. Christianity, Christian would have been a term they associated with themselves at the time. But to define what they became and they influenced later, for our understanding, we say Jewish Christian. That first period there, 70, we don't have any text from that period. And I know that we place theoretically some of the epistles, maybe, the formations of the gospels or the oral sayings that became the gospels, but we don't have any physical evidence from that. And I think one of the biggest reasons, and I'm going to get into your thesis about the Flavian dynasty in a second here, but we don't have evidence from 70 and before, and one of the big reasons I feel is because the destruction of the temple, they burned and destroyed all kind of things. I mean, there was they destroyed the temple. And in that, the Romans were known for destroying libraries and evidence and stuff. um, but I place that movement within the Essene, the Zealot, the Sicarii. We have within the Gospels, Simon the Zealot, the sons of Zebedee, which the sons of thunder, which that was something associated with the Zealots. Judas Iscariot, uh, it comes from the Sicarii, which were the violent branch of the Zealots, which the Zealots were an offshoot of the Essenes, and if for those who follow Eisenman and others, we place the early, Jewish Christian Jesus and James movement within the Essenes, and so for me, it's a hard. I am really convinced of, the statement, to by a sword and things like that, that there is elements that this movement was violent and revolutionary, and I believe that they participated in the first Jewish Roman War, and the reason that their movement changes after that is because of that, and it's why I believe they didn't join the Bar Kokhba revolt, because their first attempt failed. um but my point is, we have no text from that period. Jumping to the next one, where we have um, the Bar Kokhba revolt, there's another, sacking of Jerusalem, destruction, war that happens. And so we don't have good evidence before that. Now, to your thesis, that the Flavians influenced or wrote the text, I place four layers of redaction in the New Testament when you're looking at text. One I call the first, the pro-Roman layer, which for me, that may kind of touch on the area that you say the Flavian dynasty had influence. Pay unto Caesar, submission to authorities. I think that's the period those things came in. And then I see the Marcionite layer, which are first physical, like gospel, like proto Luke, I would call it, was Marcions, because the earliest Luke was very close to Marcion's. And so did the Proto-Luke come first or the Marcion's Luke come first? I mean, they're very close because they don't have the virgin birth, the miracles. And like for him, he didn't even rely on Jewish scripture to say he's the Messiah. And so I think there was an early view that maybe that wasn't there yet. Um, and that would have been our earliest, epistle. Then the third layer for me is now the reaction to Marcion, where they start to, realign it with a little bit of Jewishness, because Marcion was like, "Nah, we're cutting it all out." And then for me, the final layer is when we get to the Nicene Council and the Catholicization, the unifying of text and bringing everything together. And I'm not gonna go too far there, but for me, for that period post the first Jewish Roman War, the sacking of Jerusalem, destroying the temple, um, I place that pro-Roman layer in there. What is your strongest evidence for the Flavian influence upon that period of time right there?
Whew, what a big
That was a
question.
lot.
And it's got a lot of elements to it. And I agree with many of the things you said there, by the way. Where we may have a disagreement is about the role of Marcionitism. And I don't want to overstate my thesis, because I don't think that the Gospels, I think they were written for their own communities by different hands. Unlike some who believe in Roman or Flavian influence, I don't believe that the Gospels were written simultaneously or anything like that. I think they were written for their own communities by different hands at a later period. And the Jesus movement had been utterly separated from the Flavians at that point, because the Flavians were no longer in power as a dynasty. Now, we are, what you say in the first instance is correct. We don't have any even physical fragments of our New Testament literature until well into the 2nd century. We don't have good attestation to the contents of that New Testament until well into the 2nd century. And so that should cause us to question things. The other thing you say that is very profound and important is documents were destroyed at the First Jewish War. We are so lucky that in the middle of the 20th century, we discovered things like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they appear to have been hidden away precisely because, and there was this Jewish war. Now, it could have been over a period of time that they were deposited there, but clearly they want to protect their literature, particularly the sectarian literature that we read there, the famous, what's called the sectarian literature of the scrolls, to protect it. And that's because, of course, the rebel movement was smashed and at that period, and the temple was destroyed in the year 70 AD. Now, putting a few things together, though, about timing that I think is important also. Oh, and by the way, in the middle of the 20th century, we found Nag Hammadi. Why on earth would these Gnostics have tried to hide their library in the desert in Egypt, but to protect them against Orthodox Christianity, which was then taking over the Roman Empire? And so, yeah, we have to be aware that literature has been lost, and the literature of the first Jewish Christian, and I think, for lack of a better term, let's go with that, the first Jewish Christian movement was likely to have been not preserved. That I think is true. We have found fragments of Dead Sea Scroll material, sectarian Dead Sea Scroll material at Masada, which fell in 73, which I think is very fascinating and shows a connection between what Hippolytus called the militant Essenes, if you will. And even Josephus gives us hints that there was a militant, despite what he says about the Essenes being peace-loving and so forth. We do even have hints in Josephus that there was a militant Essene movement. And I think our apocalyptic guys like John the Baptist are a good demonstration of that, because surely apocalypse was the genre of our rebels. I think we have circumstantial evidence, though, that needs to be attended to. For example, the Jesus prophecy in the first 3 Gospels is a very interesting one. He predicts the destruction of the temple, he predicts the destruction of Jerusalem, and he predicts the fulfillment of Daniel's Son of Man prophecy at the same time. And he said it'll happen within the lifetime of my listeners. That would be a big fat mistake if it was preserved to, if that the prophecy suggests to me, like most prophecies, they're post-event. So I agree with those scholars who would say, well, that the synoptics could not have been written before the destruction of the temple for that reason. Jesus gives a pretty detailed description of what would happen that matches that of Josephus. But wait a minute, what about this glorious coming of the Son of Man, which is also predicted to happen within the lifetime of Jesus's listeners? If that had been written too far beyond the event, it would have been retaining a solid, what Christians, certainly later Christians, would regard to be a big fat mistake. Where is this glorious coming of the Son of Man? How did that occur around 70 AD? I don't take seriously the Israel only folks. So it is temple obsessed. It is finding Jesus is the new temple. You know, in the Gospels, they develop this idea even from Paul. And so the destruction of the temple is this huge psychological trauma, if you will, religious trauma and theological crisis that needs to be attended to. And so much of Christian literature as we have it is absorbed with that. We also have consistent attestation, at least, to the fact that Jesus was crucified and crucified under Pilate. Now, what he said and what he did, according to the Gospels, is a whole separate question. But why? First, let's ask the question, why would the Romans crucify Jesus? They must have regarded him as a political threat. And that goes to your point that the original Jesus movement was a kind of rebel movement, or at least associated with violent rebel movements. Jesus is constantly chiding his disciples in the Gospels that no, his kingdom is not of this earth. You guys are expecting, he tells Pilate in John, but more than that, he's telling his disciples, you guys are expecting this earthly kingdom. You've got it all wrong, which is suggesting that the tradition understands that Jesus's disciples were, in fact, expecting an earthly kingdom to overthrow, at least gain independence for the Jews in Judea. That means an earthly revolution, an earthly rebellion, very much like the rebellions we see in the 1st and 2nd century. Absolutely. The normal conception of Messiah, as we can read in the sectarian documents of the scrolls, is just that. A violent rebellion is to be expected, and angelic forces will help us in this battle, reminiscent of the Daniel Son of Man prophecy. We know that the Romans used Jewish messianic religion in their own propaganda, and this begins with the Flavians. The Flavians really don't have this long, impressive aristocratic lineage like the Julio-Claudians did, and so when they come to power in 69, at the end of 69, the beginning of 70 AD, they have to have a whole new basis for their legitimacy of their dynastic rule. And who do they hire? They hired Josephus, a Jew, as their chief propagandist. And Josephus tells us, well, you know, God has gone over to the side of the Romans, and the main cause of this rebellion are the Jewish messianic prophecies. That's echoed in non-Jewish historians like Tacitus. Furthermore, Josephus says point blank that, well, you know, the Jewish rebels, they got it wrong. If they were expecting an earthly Messiah king to help them defeat the Romans, and that was the cause of the rebellion, it was really pointing to my boss, the Roman Emperor Vespasian. And furthermore, Josephus invokes the Son of Man prophecy in Daniel when he says that in the Jewish wars, which he wrote in the 70s, there were armies seen fighting in the clouds, just as at the sack of Jerusalem, mind you, and that's Josephus's description. He was there with Titus when that happened. So Josephus is not only saying that the Roman emperor, here is a Jewish guy saying that the new Roman emperor is in effect the real Messiah of Jewish prophecy, not like those rebels thought, when that's what really caused the war. And more than that, he's invoking the Son of Man prophecy in Daniel as being fulfilled at that time in a creepy echo of exactly what Jesus is saying in all three of the synoptics in the famous Jesus apocalypse. Suetonius and Tacitus, who are writing, these are pagan Romans, writing in the early 2nd century, they completely confirm that both Vespasian and Titus were point blank the Jewish messiahs. They echo, Tacitus in particular echoes what Josephus has said. that in fact the messianic prophecies were the main cause of the first Jewish rebellion. But of course, those Jews got it wrong. It was Vespasian and Titus, the first Flavian emperors, who were in fact the Jewish messiahs. We're even told that Yohanan ben Zakkai, the famous rabbi who started the school at Yavna, was compelled to recognize Vespasian as the Jewish Messiah. So there is no question that the early Flavian emperors had as a part of their imperial cult and a part of their imperial propaganda the notion that they were the Jewish messiahs of prophecy, and they even hired a Jewish writer to be their main propagandist. Then we see all kinds of connections between the Flavian family and Christianity itself. And here I would turn to Paul's letter to the Philippians. In one relatively short letter, Paul tells us about Clement and Epaphroditus, Caesar's household, and the Praetorium. That is a remarkable little letter. What the heck are we talking about here? He's connected with Caesar's household, and he's talking about a Clement and an Epaphroditus. Well, Suetonius tells us, again, a pagan Roman, not a Christian, in the early 2nd century, he tells us that there was a Titus Flavius Clemens, a member of the imperial Flavian family, who was executed, and executed at about the same time as one of the leading Flavian freedmen, who was helping the Flavians run the empire, a guy named Epaphroditus, who was also Josephus in his later works, the Antiquities, for example, he dedicates to Epaphroditus, his patron, those works. That suggests that, and Josephus says, well, I'm going to tell you the history of our people. And of course, the Antiquities lays out a parallel history of the Jews that we get from Hebrew scripture. So the fact that we've got a Clement and an Epaphroditus being executed about the same time under Domitian. Interestingly, Dio Cassius, the later historian, tells us that Titus Flavius Clement was executed by Domitian for adopting Jewish ways or Jewish mode of life. So he's not saying outright that he's a Jew. So what does that mean? It could mean that he's associated with Christianity, that he is a believer in this, and that Jesus was in fact utilized, even though Jesus did not say that in his actual lifetime, that prophecy that Jesus is attributed to Jesus in the synoptics would be, I mean, who else could be the fulfillment of the Daniel Son of Man prophecy when the Jews are facing such utter disaster and ruin? I mean, their temple is destroyed, their leadership, all those false messiahs who were rebels had failed. So who could possibly be fulfilling the glorious aspect of the Son of Man prophecy within the lifetime of Jesus's hearers? Well, we're given a big fat candidate by Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius. The Flavians claim to be the Jewish messiahs who came to rule the world and were promoters of now transnational peace. And so we have an association of the Flavians. Traditionally, of course, Clement's wife, Flavia Domitilla, her burial site, by tradition, are the catacombs of Domitilla. And in the catacombs of Domitilla, we have the big inscription that tells us it's the Flavian sepulchre, and it is perhaps the oldest of all the catacombs. And we have all kinds of Flavian imagery in that catacomb, fish and anchors in particular. The terribly interesting in this connection, if I can just go on for just a little bit more,
Yeah.
the Seleucids, back in the Hellenistic period, rulers of, say, the area of Syria, famously who fought the Jews in the Maccabean, when the Jews rebelled against Assyrian rule in the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids, they claimed to be descendants of Apollo. And they used a very distinct symbol, an anchor wrapped with a dolphin wrapped about it. And that is the Seleucid anchor, if you will, an anchor with a dolphin. Homer tells the famous story of how Apollo transformed himself into a dolphin. And so to associate, you go to Delos, the legendary birthplace of Apollo, an island, a Greek island, you'll see that image there. Perhaps Seleucid patronage is what got the image there. Well, we have Clement of Alexandria, another Titus Flavius Clemens, writing at the turn of the 2nd to the 3rd centuries, he is saying that the anchor is an appropriate Christian symbol. He not only tells us that the anchor is an appropriate Christian symbol, he says this symbol came from the Seleucids. If this is correct, then it is, as you can see from the images from the Seleucids themselves, the anchor with the dolphin wrapped about it. What's interesting is that Titus was the first Roman emperor to use the Seleucid anchor himself. And so you can see many copies of the coins with Titus's face on one side and the dolphin wrapped around an anchor on the other side, and different issues, different types of coins Titus used this for. It's somewhat distinctive to Titus. He's the first Roman emperor to use this at all. Augustus had used a trident with a fish wrapped about it, or fish coming towards it. But that's not the same image. It's a trident, not the Seleucid anchor. Now, of course, it makes perfect sense for a Roman emperor to use the Seleucid anchor as a symbol, and that's clearly where Titus himself got it. Roman emperors used Apollo-related imagery themselves on coinage. Many Roman emperors of the 1st century used Apollo-related imagery. Titus, who was active in, of course, the Middle East, the Near East, is adopting it from the Seleucids. I think there's really little question about it. You can find even earlier Jewish coins that use just the anchor, which is also fascinating. They leave out the fish, because I think that might be a graven image, again, that might offend Torah orthodoxy. Nonetheless, we have Titus using it. That image was discontinued when his brother, after some time though, after his brother became emperor, his brother did not participate in the Jewish war and could not make the same claims to being the Jewish Messiah. So he discontinued its use. The only other Roman emperor who used the Seleucid anchor, interestingly, was Hadrian, who was fighting off the Bar Kokhba crowd. So we really have two emperors who initiated its use in a Roman context on Roman coins. That's Titus and Hadrian. And Titus is unique in that he claimed to be a Jewish Messiah. You can find this in Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius. And now we have Clement of Alexandria saying, it's the Seleucid anchor. And why the heck would we use the Seleucid anchor if we're Christians? And Clement of Alexandria specifically says the anchor that the Seleucids used. So we have a Christian writing at the turn of the 2nd to the 3rd century saying, use this Seleucid anchor for the symbol for Jesus, a Jewish Messiah, and Titus, who'd claimed to be a Jewish Messiah, was the first Roman emperor and pretty distinctive to him, using this symbol, who was also, and interestingly enough, Clement of Rome, who was sometimes associated with Titus Flavius Clemens of the late 1st century, who was executed by his cousin, the Emperor Domitian. His legendary death was being martyred by being tied to an anchor and thrown into the sea. So we have all kinds of anchor associations with the Flavians. We have all kinds of anchor associations in early Christianity. The Catholic Encyclopedia, for example, will tell you that before the time of Constantine, the anchor was a more common symbol used for Jesus than the cross in the early catacombs. So if you're looking around to late 2nd century or 3rd century imagery, you will find more anchors than you will crosses in the pre-Constantine period to symbolize Jesus. But you'll even find these dolphins on the doors of the Hagia Sophia in what is today Istanbul, in Constantinople. So, and you can just walk into an Orthodox or Catholic church today and see all kinds of anchors, all kinds of fish imagery. There's one, if you can see here, the image we have on the cover of the book. This comes from a mosaic that was recovered from Herculaneum that was buried because of the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, when Pompeii and Herculaneum were destroyed by the eruption of the volcano Vesuvius. So it's frozen in time in the year 79 AD, which is shortly into the reign of Titus, the year that Vespasian dies. And because of the earthquakes that preceded that eruption, there was a lot of new reconstruction, remodeling, fixing. And so this image is likely a Flavian era image. And here we can see, if you can see that my background, here is an anchor, and we've got fish, person, aiming towards the symbolic safety of an anchor. So there we even have the overlap of the fish to men imagery with the anchor being used as a symbol of safety. Now, that is, as far as I'm concerned, a perfectly pagan use, but a Flavian era use of anchors and fish. And Titus, of course, would, at the same period of time, be initiating the use of the anchor wrapped by a dolphin. Most ancients believed that dolphins were fish, indeed the king of fish. And so this combination of fish and anchor, but here, interestingly, in a purely pagan Flavian era use, we can see fish and men both aiming towards the anchor. So you go, make you fishers of men. And the copious fish imagery that we hear about in Christian literature. And whew, thank you for letting me get all that out
Yeah,
at
yeah.
once.
Well, and we know that the ichthus fish was a early Christian symbol. The letters standing for I Isus, so it was like Jesus Christ.
Son of God, Savior.
Yeah, 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 the ichthus fish. So,
And it
and it
happens
was interesting that you mentioned Pompeii because one of the early physical attestation to the existence of Christianity, they found the house church in Pompeii that they date to the mid third century, I think. What were you gonna say?
Oh yeah, I mean that's exactly it. Everyone is, I hope, familiar with the idea of the fish being used as an early Christian symbol because it does in Greek it does sort of play out a name game which spells out Jesus and some of his titles, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. So if you take the first word for first letter of each of those, it happens to spell out the term fish, and of course that would have mystic significance. It's funny, you might have rearranged a couple of those things or put in a different title, but putting it that way, the fish is absolutely a symbol because guess what? It's also used in the Gospels as symbolism. Um, no question about that. I mean, Jesus recruits Peter and Andrew, his brother, by saying, guys, and fish, the fish miracle of the coin, the fish, the feeding of the multitude with fish, 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 fish. It's all over early Christian literature. I'll
Mhm.
turn you into fishers of men, you see. And here we have in the pagan use, men fish, men fish. And as far as I can tell, that's a Flavian era pagan use of it.
Mhm. So for the going back to the first century, I want to. So there were a few key elements to the evolving community. You know, from our best attestation of what existed in the first century, it was majority what we call Jewish Christian groups. The famous of these is Nazarene and Ebionites. The Gnostics, they started to rise, more in the second century. And then the what you call the proto-Orthodox, what becomes Catholicism, which is by extension becomes all of Christianity because everything springs out of that. Even all the Protestant and Reformation movements, they came out of Catholic. They didn't come out of something that existed before. Um, but when we're looking at the first century, there are some interesting clues. For me, there's even some very big clues that Marcion influenced the New Testament as we have it. But for what I see in the first century, we have a majority Jewish Christian groups, and by and large, all of these groups reject Paul as a heretic, and his text is not part of their tradition. When we look at the Ebionite and Nazarenes, they were known to have a Hebrew version of the Gospels, the Old Testament, the Tanakh, and maybe epistles of Peter and James, um, because I know within the Clementine homilies and recognitions, we have various, gospels and epistles attributed to Peter and James. Ones that don't necessarily make it into the New Testament later. Um, but all the majority of groups rejected Paul as a heretic, and none of them accepted him. And so when we're moving into that's first century, move into the second century, the first attestation of what you would call a New Testament with Gospels and epistles is Marcion's, and he is the first to include seven, I think it was, of the Pauline epistles. Um, and it's not till mid second century that we start seeing references to what has been referred to as the proto-Orthodox inclusion of Paul. And so the first attestation that Paul's letters start to become recognized and used is one, the polemics against Marcion, and his, Evangelion and his Apostolicon, I think is what they called it. But it was his, his version of a gospel, his collection of Paul's letters, because at this point, no one else had a collection of Paul's letters that was in large circulation. And that Marcion's community became kind of attached to the Johannian community because the Marcionites were the first to widely distribute the Gospel of John. Um, because thematically it has elements that kind of line up with Marcion's philosophy. And then we have the rise of the Gnostics. And you mentioned that we have Gospels from, essentially four communities. And as you see them, you have the Jewish Christian groups. You have the Marcionite community, Johannian community, but and there's the biggest clue in the New Testament of Marcion's influence is how Paul's letters play such a big. There's so many of them. When a majority in the first century completely rejected Paul, the Gnostics, so the major groups up until Marcion and the Proto-Orthodox, the Jewish Christians in the first century, the Gnostics, they all rejected Paul as a heretic. And then it wasn't Marcion is who revitalized Paul, and the Proto-Orthodox, because if you look at Marcion's philosophy, it was heavily in Platonianism. The God of the Old Testament was the Demerge, and those ideas are what start to kind of feed this for the secular Jews, the Hellenists, and for the intellectual elite in Rome, this convergence of ideas that starts to take Paul and develop this other religion that becomes Christianity. I know you said you take a different view on Marcion, but I really feel that Marcion really starts to tap into this, Hellenistic influence that you have with just kind of an idea that you want to secularize Judaism and assimilate into Roman culture, and the intellectual elites who were starting to play with the ideas of monotheism, monogamy, moving away from the polytheism. There was an intrigue in that, and I feel like it was that little vein that started to spin off that made Paul popular, because Paul, the problem of Paul is historical Jesus does not rely on Paul. The historical Jesus, when we looks very much like the Ebionite, early Ebionite and Nazarene Jesus, who was Torah Orthodox. His disciples converted people to Judaism through circumcision and mikvah and a communal meal, as can be seen in the Clementine homilies and some of the other, texts from that period outside of the canonical Gospels. And I know that's a lot. But for me, I was just going back to that's where I see the big influence of Marcion propagating Paul. And then that's the catalyst for me that develops what becomes Christianity.
Well, I think you make, again, let me focus on the areas where we agree. I think that the argument, for example, that Paul reveals in Galatians would make no sense if Jesus and the original Jesus movement were not Torah Orthodox. That is to say, we're told in the letter to the Galatians by Paul that he's arguing with James over circumcision. He's arguing with Cephas to his face over eating with Gentiles. And Paul does not quote Jesus. There would be plenty of material in our canonical Gospels. Jesus says it's not what goes into your body that defiles, but what comes out of it. He is critical of the Sabbath. He is critical of the Jewish authorities of the time, Pharisees, scribes, and so forth. He praises the faith of a Roman centurion. Now, in his age of Jewish rebellion, Messianic rebellion, he praises not just a Roman, but a Roman centurion's faith as exceeding that of any Jew. Now, those are all very curious things. Paul does not cite any of that gospel material, which would have helped him in his argument with James and Cephas. Paul rather says, I got this stuff that I'm telling you about in Galatians I didn't get it from men. I got it from my own direct revelation of Jesus. So he has to rely on his own revelation of Jesus. Elsewhere in the Pauline corpus, he argues against circumcision, for example, and he nowhere cites any of the Torah critical material that we get in Jewish literature thereafter, Christian literature thereafter. So it is perfectly obvious to me that this guy who's got his own revelation, according to Galatians, is arguing with earlier leaders of the Jesus movement. That directly tells me that Jesus and his immediate followers were Torah orthodox. And I think that there's no way to understand Galatians except by understanding that what Paul's doing is he's taking the Jesus movement in a whole new non-Torah orthodox direction. When that happened, we can dispute. I'd go further. We look at one of the first references to Jesus that I think is pretty solid in non-Jewish or Christian literature, and that's Tacitus. In his history, the Annals, he tells us that in 64 AD, when the Great Fire of Rome happened, he tried to pin the blame on this group of people called Christians who were followers of Jesus, and he locates that as our Jesus who was crucified. Now, let's hold the phone here for a second. Within 30 years of Jesus's crucifixion, or about 30 years or so after Jesus's crucifixion, what we have are that number of Christians that could be a plausible scapegoat for the Great Fire of Rome in 64. And more than that, in order to be a plausible scapegoat, they can't be these pro-Roman pacifists that we read about in the New Testament, can they? No, Tacitus is telling us that these are abominable. This is just 2 years, mind you, 64. This is just 2 years before the outbreak of the Great Jewish Rebellion in 66. And so what it seems to me is Tacitus seems to be confirming that the pre-war Jesus movement was not just Torah orthodox, as Galatians would suggest, but also militant. And we have echoes of that, as you pointed out, within the New Testament. But I think that's just bleed through among all that pacifist, turn the other cheek, love your enemy, etc. Talk that centurions are great, pay your taxes, and on and on and on and on and on. I mean, even with Paul, we have a direct political statement in Romans 13 that is absolutely anti-rebellion, pro-taxes, obey the government, they're the agents of God. So Paul in Romans 13 is very much like Josephus, saying that the Jewish God has gone over to the Roman side. And so I think we have plenty of evidence. Now consider Josephus too. In the James reference in the Antiquities, James is hauled before the Sanhedrin and he's killed along with certain others. The Sanhedrin takes advantage of the absence of a Roman governor to have James stoned 62, just 2 years before the Great Fire of Rome. That again suggests to me that the Jewish establishment is trying to tamp down these radicals. They would be Torah orthodox, and why would they then be offensive to the Sanhedrin? Well, they're militants. And the Romans are much more political, let's put it this way, about trying to accommodate the Jewish forces at the time. The Sanhedrin identifies James as being a problem, and they stone him in 62, according to Josephus. This all suggests to me that the original Jesus movement was militant, Torah orthodox, apocalyptic, associated with people like John the Baptist, who was fire and brimstone. So I do agree with you that the original Jesus movement, let's call them the Jewish Christian movement for lack of a better term, they were not only Torah orthodox, they were militants. That's why Jesus was crucified. Jesus claimed to be the King of the Jews. That's the charge against him. And what's interesting is that the Gospels seem to be standing on their head or turning themselves into pretzels to blame the Jews for what is distinctively a Roman mode of execution. I have no doubt, as in the James case, that the Sanhedrin is working closely with the Roman government. So there may have been an association there. But what we're talking about here is a Roman execution done under a Roman governor. And the Romans must have identified Jesus as a political threat, one of these militant messiahs who helped cause the war, according to Josephus and Tacitus and so forth. So I think in my mind, there's little question that the original Jewish Christians were not only Torah orthodox, but militant. And what we have in our Greek New Testament is a critical reaction to that. They're turning at Jesus inside out, upside down, in effect, the exact opposite of what the historical Jesus would have looked like. And so
Mhm.
our New Testament, in fact, in general, I would say if we pan back and look at our New Testament, whenever it was written, it is a critical reaction to the Jewish rebels of the first 2 centuries because they
Yeah.
were apocalyptic, messianic, utilizing all. Look at the Dead Sea Scrolls to get a flavor of what they were probably like. Very militant, expecting God to help them in a war of independence against the Romans. And as our historical sources all say, it was these messianic prophecies that most inspired the first Jewish war. And we can
Yeah.
see a messianic leader in the second great Jewish rebellion, Bar Kokhba, son of the star. And so these messianic Jewish rebellions are not disconnected from the emergence of our Christianity, our Greek
Yeah.
Testament. In fact, it would seem to be bizarre coincidence that Christianity emerged at just the same time as these great Jewish wars. No,
Mhm.
our Greek New Testament is in many ways a critical reaction,
Yeah.
the
And very much
photographic,
post
the
Bar
photographic
Kokhba.
inverse, you see, of the
Yeah.
rebels themselves. Does that
Yeah.
make
Yeah, no. So here's the thing. I'm in agreement with your thesis. I build the bones differently how I get there. It's I see some different key elements that build. So it may be an other side of the same story. Um, really, for me, the New Testament is post, Jewish Roman wars, post Bar Kokhba revolt. Maybe the physical evidence is all after that. We allege through scholarly work that the text comes from earlier, but that also doesn't prevent the fact that there may be intentional additions to the story in the text that we find copies of, even though it predates existing. So, I mean, I'm saying the same thing in different words and I build it in a different way because there are key things that I see. Um, the New Test, Paul, which, a lot of people feel like his theology influenced the Gospels. There's those that think the epistles came before the Gospels and that Paul's theology influences the Gospels that we have. Which all goes back to how I see the diverging movements in the first century, the early Jewish Christians, and we have some historical clues for me that continue the Jewish revolt movement, and there are key reasons why I also think that the Jesus James movement that participated in the first Jewish Roman War historically refused to get involved with Bar Kokhba because their first failed attempt. But for me, what becomes Paul, the New Testament, and how it becomes this very and this is for me uh the Roman psyop, the influence campaign, really to influence the text, the tradition. Um, there's some key events. We have the Jewish tax to discourage people practicing Judaism in the second century. We have for me a key event is the split between the Ebionites and Nazarenes. The early Nazarenes rejected Paul, but then there was a group that accepted Paul's teachings a little bit. And in 90 Common Era, we have the institution of the Birchat Hamanim, the benediction against the Manim, the heretics, where a group of Nazarenes were rejected from the synagogue. And the reason in the Talmud Christians are referred to as Nazarene is because those who followed Paul, that branch of Nazarene, is the branch that the proto Orthodox latched onto, and that started to develop what became Christianity. It's kind of involved, but I'm not going to get too deep into that. But that group of Nazarenes that were rejected from the synagogue and held on to Paul's, then you see Marcion holding on to Paul, and then the proto Orthodox taking Paul, and then Paul becoming part of the Catholic thing. Within that corpus, and you play in the Jewish tax, you have an intentional redirection where they're trying to move them away from this Jewish messianism. There's a taxation to discourage you from outwardly expressing Jewishness because then you get taxed. Then they have this textual tradition that starts to play into Platonianism, Hellenism, finds ways in secular, in um, Hellenistic Judaism, with influences from the Greek Septuagint and, moving more into that intellectual frame that starts to build the Pauline epistles, the gospels that are influenced by that. And I'm not saying that the gospels don't reflect the communities they came from, but they show textual influence from the epistles. And so for me, there's this line, like they're trying to course correct. They don't want to keep having these violent revolutionaries, and so they're trying to find a way to appeal to the intellectual elites, the Jewish Hellenists, the those who want to assimilate with Roman culture, and they start trying to influence the text in that direction. That's kind of where I see some key clues. I know I build the bones differently though.
Well, it's very interesting the way you build the bones, though. I mean, it's fascinating. I think that the Pauline epistles do precede the Gospels. Paul is largely ignorant of the stories and content of the Gospels. Like we can start there. Secondly, the Gospels reflect a Torah critical Jesus, a pro Roman Jesus, a Jesus who can praise centurions, tell us to pay our taxes, and more than that. I'll come back to that in a second. But there is no physical resurrection in Paul's letters, for example. And so there's little question in my mind that the Pauline epistles, whatever we regard as the first and authentic Pauline epistles, come before the Gospels. As I say, otherwise Paul would have cited all of the convenient material that you find in the Gospels that would support the Pauline position, both in a pro-Roman political direction, but also in a Torah critical direction. And more than that, the Gospels are developing the idea of resurrection to an empty tomb and a physical resurrection, where in John, doubting Thomas is actually touching the wounds and so forth of Jesus. So I think we have to place the Pauline epistles before the certainly our canonical Gospels. There's no little doubt in my mind about that, and that the Gospels are developing Pauline ideas and seeming, in my view, to sort of reconcile the different strands of Judaism, including the nascent, as you point out, there's Ebionites that are basically carrying on this tradition, the poor, you see, carrying on this tradition from Jesus in a more authentically Jewish way. And so the Gospels, I think, are an attempt to reconcile different strands and leaning in different directions. Matthew is leaning more in the Jewish direction as much as he can. Luke, Acts, is obviously leaning more in the Gentile direction. He wants to tell us the story of how the message came to the Gentiles in the book of Acts and so forth. And from other aspects of the content. I mean, for Matthew, everything is a fulfillment of Scripture, even if it's not a fulfillment of Scripture, and so forth. So it's as though they're writing for slightly different audiences, a more Jewish leaning audience in the case of Matthew, a more Gentile leaning audience in the case of Luke. Now, on the other hand, I think we can't dismiss a relatively early composition to the Gospels. Jesus, otherwise, I mean, forget the Flavian connection even for a second, to put into Jesus's mouth a prediction that there'd be a glorious coming of the Son of Man within the lifetime of his listeners would be to preserve a big fat mistake if we get too far away from the moment of the temple's destruction. So I think we can use textual clues within some of the texts to indicate how approximately when they were written, or how far away they sort of had to have been written. Now, it added to the complexity, though, as you point out, is the Marcionite edition of Paul's letters, the Apostolos, the Apostolicon. I tend to think, and yeah, I will defer, to other experts on this, but I tend to think that that is a reduction. I mean, it's not always the case that the shorter, simpler version is the older version. I think there were elements that Marcionites found objectionable in even Paul's letters. And so I tend to think of the Apostolos as a reduction, an edited down version of Paul's letters. Now, lots of people were writing in the name of Paul. I mean, in fact, his letter to the second letter to the Thessalonians, he says, ignore all those letters that seem to be written in my name, which suggests that there were a whole bunch of letters of Paul that he's asking us to ignore as not genuine. that means that there was a variety of letters that said a variety of things, and could, I mean, as Paul himself says, I'm all things to all men. To those under the law, I'm under the law. To those not, I'm not, so I can win over as many as possible. Well, it's an overt statement of sort of hypocrisy right there and
Mm,
dishonesty. He's trying to be all things to all men, even if he has to change his tune, change it like a chameleon changes colors from one audience to the other. Um, this suggests to me that Paul could be utilized by a variety of communities.
mm,
This also suggests to me that we have a variety of what we might call Christianities. Certainly
mm,
by the second century, we've
mm,
got different schools of the Jesus movement. Those that are trying to incorporate Paul's pro Roman, anti Torah views are what's going to be reflected and what become our canonical gospels. But surely there is some kind of gospel of the Ebionites or gospel of the Hebrews. And boy, I would love to see the full text of that,
mm,
because that I think might reflect the more authentic Jesus movement, which, as I say, by inference, I strongly suspect was Torah orthodox and more militant. Now we are given quotes of that because from church fathers and stuff, which give us some idea. But again, even that might have had different versions of it, just as there might be different versions of Matthew or Luke.
mm,
Professor Ehrman, for example, believes that the whole first section, Luke sort of starts twice, and the
mm,
whole first section, including the Nativity, is sort of tacked on to a
mm.
proto Luke
Yeah.
that we had. And that proto Luke might be the very thing that the Marcionites used.
Yeah.
So I'm
They very
very
much
open.
align. They're very similar. They don't have the nativity and the miracles and some of the other stuff. Like the proto Luke and Marcians are like pretty much identical. There's not a lot of difference between those two.
Yeah, I think there is a relate that we're told even specifically that they only recognized Luke or a version of Luke. And that makes sense because Marcion is de-Judaizing. He doesn't like all this Jewish stuff. He ignores the Hebrew scriptures, and so he's going to strip out in his own thinking as much this Jewish stuff from the Jesus movement as possible. That's why it's important for him to preserve a copy of Paul, and his movement had a certain version of Paul because that's the direction he's going to take Paul in a further direction. Now there were, of course, Greek philosophy is influencing Judaism all over the place, even relatively early on. But by the time you get to the first century with Philo and Josephus, we're talking about politically pro Roman Jews who are using Greek philosophy, Platonism, Stoicism. And Josephus is telling us, comparing the different Jewish sects to two schools of Greek philosophy. Philo himself, there's no question, he's absolutely integrating Platonism, Stoicism, the Logos idea, working it into Judaism. But
Mhm,
both Philo and Josephus, of course, are politically pro Roman Jews as well,
mhm.
unlike the Jewish rebels of the time.
Yeah.
And so by the time you get to Paul, this has really reached, this Hellenization has reached a new point, a new apex. And
Mhm,
Paul has thoroughly, if he has to twist Hebrew scripture on its head to make its point, and he will twist Jewish scripture on its head to make his point, he's taking that Hellenization, this influence of Greco-Roman philosophy and politics to new heights. Now, when that happened, I think I'm going to be still, although I have, as I say, moved away from a mid first century view of Paul's letters, I still think it's a first century context for various reasons. Paul has to be, in my view, writing before the Gospels, and the Gospels themselves could not have been written too much after the destruction of the temple. Otherwise, Jesus' prophecy would really look like a big
mhm.
fat mistake that really has
Well,
not been explained by Christians, that the glorious coming of the Son of Man is going to happen within the lifetime of Jesus's listeners around 30 CE. Well, when you've passed a century beyond that, it really becomes obvious, big glaring mistake. And so the Gospel of John, which most scholars regard as the last of the Gospels, excludes that altogether. that prophecy has become somewhat irrelevant and somewhat embarrassing, let me suggest, to early Christians. This
Mm,
would suggest that the Gospels were written sometime between the two Jewish wars. And as I say, the other evidence suggests to me that Paul's authentic letters, at least, were written before the Gospels, although in a post war context. This would place at least the beginnings of our canonical literature through textual evidence and inferences we can draw from what the text is saying between, the two Jewish wars. So I believe that most of our New Testament, that's why it had canonical authority later on, was written, although there was all kinds of other literature, letters of Paul that he's dismissing in Second Thessalonians and so forth, much more Hebrew connected to the Jewish Christian movement material. I think there's all kinds of other literature, but our canonical, what would become our canonical Christian literature at a later phase, was written between the two Jewish wars, or no later than around the time or shortly after Hadrian. I,
mm,
it just from the textual evidence, I think that's the strongest case to be made. Um,
yeah. Well,
that's how I believe what I believe. Let me put it that
okay. I mean, it's reasonable. I always just go back to when do we first first physical copies, and the first physical copies, the oldest Paul's epistles is Papyrus 46, which they date to around 200 Common Era. So for me, like it's the physical evidence before everything. The theories are helpful in understanding where this may have came from, but for me, I push back on the theories. I'm like, it's a good theory. I mean, it's reasoned, it's well thought out, it's logical, makes sense. For me, the physical evidence is what is prima facie, the most important thing for me. And then, we do work to rebuild where this came from.
it's a minimal date, though. When we get the
Yeah.
physical evidence, we know it exists by the point we start getting the physical evidence. It doesn't tell us that the material in the text itself wasn't written earlier. In fact, there may be if there is good reason to believe that it was written before, we should attend to that evidence, it seems to me. And it's hard to deny, when we're told of Justin Martyr pleading before Antoninus Pius, that's mid second century. And he's already got, he doesn't cite Paul, if I recall myself correctly, which is interesting, isn't it? But
Mhm.
he seems to be aware of what we would call the New Testament Jesus, because he's aware even of the pagan religious parallels, which he himself is citing. And to have an audience before the emperor himself,
Mhm.
not everyone gets a trial before the emperor. Normally, the praetors would run their own, criminal courts and stuff. Maybe if you were a big politician, you'd get a trial in the Senate. But to have the emperor himself hear your case means it's a significant thing, and getting some high-ranking sympathy. So Justin Martyr in the middle of the second century, Papias, I think, is writing shortly before that, and we certainly have in the second half of the second century Christian writers of a variety of Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and so for them to have an advanced Christian theology, even when they're taught, even when they're dissing heretics like Marcion, which they do spend a good deal of their time dissing Marcion, but we have Irenaeus at least testifying to four gospels. We have Christian writers in the mid to late second century who are really starting to attest to a real Christian movement that we would recognize. So that suggests that another no later than date, not an earliest possible. And when we start getting physical evidence or we get attestation, then we have to pay serious attention to the fact that for them to have this view of Christianity, or for them to have this view of the literature, the text itself must be a bit older than that. Does that make sense?
I mean, yeah. I mean, but yes and no. Yes, there's a
I love
yes.
you, my
Like
brother.
so, the Moratian, Moratorian canon has a list of Paul's letters. So there's an indication, mid second, early third century. I think it was between 170 and 200, somewhere in there. There's a list of Paul's epistles. So I go with physical evidence first. I do listen to theories, but I accept them as theory, not fact. Um, we don't know what form or shape the original epistles existed. So I'm not saying that the epistles don't exist before physical copies. And I'm not saying the gospels don't exist before physical copies. I just don't accept that those early physical copies reflect the ones found or the ones later that became accepted by Christianity. So first for me is prima facie is physical. Theories inform and educate. They're reasoned. They're well thought out. They're good. They give good clues. But we don't know for fact that what is in the found copy is what was in the original copy. And for me, physical evidence comes first. I mean,
Right. And we
you
don't need
worked in the legal field, and um, evidence. You need to have hard physical evidence. And so
well,
for me, that's a big thing. I did
physical
want to
evidence.
find a point of agreement on. Go ahead.
Well, physical evidence, I think, is where we have to begin, but with the understanding that the physical evidence to exist is our no later than date, and the mid to late second century is where our fragments do begin with New Testament material.
Yeah.
Um, so you're absolutely right about that. And you're absolutely right that real clear attestation of their contents doesn't begin until about that time as well,
Hmm.
about the mid second century and beyond. So we're sort of stuck making inferences from the darn texts that we've got.
Yeah.
And all we've got are those darn texts from
Hmm.
which, and you notice that's what I'm doing. I'm using ancient texts from historians and the
Hmm.
text itself to make these kind of arguments. And that is, I have to concede, since there is no earlier physical evidence and no earlier clear attestation of their
Hmm.
contents. That's what makes something like Josephus's testimonium interesting. To the extent that it is genuine, to the extent that its wording is genuine, it might contain clues. So, for example, if the testimonium in Josephus is accurate, and if we see echoes in Luke's Emmaus narrative, the normal view is that Luke was used to interpolate the testimonium. The causation may be just exactly the reverse. It could be that Luke is using the testimonium of Josephus as a basis for some of his language, and certainly in the area of the Emmaus uh, passage, uh, the causal influence may be the other way about. So a
Hmm.
lot will hinge upon, for example, what we think about the authenticity or how much of the testimonium is authentic, something like that. But apart from inferences from ancient texts, I grant you, sir, our physical evidence doesn't kick in until later, and even the attestation from writers who we can give dates to doesn't
Hmm.
kick in until later. That's simply a fact.
Yeah. So a point of agreement that I want to build a lot more to that's very interesting to me. You mentioned the Hellenistic influences that come into Paul and then the development of epistles and gospels. So the sons of Zadok, the Sadducees, this term Sadducee comes from the Zadok, the sons of Zadok, was also referenced in Qumran, and we have within the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know that the sons of Zadok, the Sadducees, relied heavily on Enochian, the books of Enoch and Enochian literature. And the thing that the Judaism branch that was hijacked and turned into Christianity, you find within Pauline epistles references to Enochian Judaism, uh, the battle between good and evil. It very much comes from the Sadducean view. Now, the reason I want to connect this is because the Sadducees were the ones running the temple at the time, and all of these movements, the Pharisees, the Essenes, the Zealots, the Zachari, saw them as impure because they aligned themselves with Roman elite and Hellenism. They were more Hellenistic. They were secular intellectuals who looked into For one, Enochian text and Daniel, they had apocalypticism of the New Testament, real revelation and stuff like that really comes from the influence of the Sadducees in the temple. Now, for all the other groups, we have all the other Jewish movements, because we have diversity of Judaism in the first century, but all of them but the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, the Zealots, the Zachariah, all saw the temple as impure because it aligned with Roman views and values and was aligning with Hellenism. And to them, that made the temple impure, and that's why they didn't participate. It's why the early James movement they were vegetarian, because they wouldn't consume meat, because meat was part of temple sacrifices. Therefore, if it's impure, we're not going to consume it. Um, but so it's that intellectual elite, the sons of Zadok, the Sadducees, and you can see the Enochian Judaism influence in Paul's epistles. The battle between light and darkness, the angelology and stuff, and I believe that's also where the attachment to apocalypticism, and for what you mentioned, post revision after the destruction of the temple, they add in their prophecy of the destruction of the temple. I feel like the branch of Judaism that was hijacked by Paul and those after him was Sadducean. And this is why, and others don't see Paul as a Pharisee, because he said, I become all things to all people. He claims to be a student, but he does not of Gamaliel, but he doesn't represent Gamaliel's ideas. His ideas are the opposite. They're not. He doesn't sound like a student of Gamaliel. His writings reflect either somebody who opposes it or comes from a different camp. But Paul's literature more aligns with Enochian Judaism, and it was there in that elite that they relied on influences from the with the Greek Septuagint and those philosophical ideas, that they started to see connections with Platonianism, and that's also where some of the views of like Trinitarianism eventually comes out. But my point was simply is that it was that branch of Hellenism that kind of, because you mentioned Hellenism, for me is what really was the through line from the first century Judaism.
Well, I think
For,
Professor Robert Eisenman makes a really good point when he asks us to distinguish between the Sadducees who ran the temple and the those who would call themselves, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian community. They were founded by a righteous teacher, a Zadik. And so when we're distinguishing between those who find the temple impure, and the Dead Sea Scrolls community certainly did believe that they went out into the wilderness to develop more pure forms of worship, and those who call themselves Sadducees who ran the temple. Philo and Josephus make it quite plain that when they divide up the schools of Jewish thought at the time, the ones that did not believe in the resurrection of the soul were the Sadducees, and those are the Sadducees who are strict Torah orthodox. There's no resurrection of souls in the Torah, and they're the ones who are running the temple. It seems to me that makes good sense. But it wouldn't make good sense if you didn't believe in the resurrection of the souls and you're that kind of Sadducee, that you would have this kind of apocalyptic literature that would use, say, Daniel, for example, as we've talked about, which talks about the resurrection of the souls. So I would distinguish, like Professor Eisenman does, between the Sadducees who run the temple and who don't believe in a resurrection of souls, according to Philo and Josephus, and what might be called the followers of the righteous teacher, or the righteous one, the Zadik, that we would read about in the Dead Sea Scrolls community. So the Essenes would regard themselves as righteous and super righteous, and yet they are distinguished and set off as, and if they are connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls community, and these Essenes are somehow connected, if in fact our Dead Sea Scrolls sectarians are these militant Essenes that Hippolytus mentions, then what we're looking at is a different group, certainly, than the Sadducees who ran the temple, who were probably cooperating with the Romans, and were probably knee deep in Roman politics with the Romans. and they're not particularly, we're told explicitly, like I say, by Josephus and Philo, they don't believe in the resurrection of the souls. And that seems to me to be at odds with our Dead Sea Scrolls community and what would be the militant Essenes
Yeah.
that,
I agree with that dichotomy. I mean, yes, I agree. There are the ones who were associated more with the Essenes. And then there were the ones that were involved with the temple, but collaborated with Romans and did seek to Hellenize. So yes, I agree that with the dichotomy you just pointed out. I didn't give that nuance when I was stating it. My point was there is those within the Sadducean branch, that Hellenistic Sadducean, that did look to the Enochian literature, and we find influences from the Greek Septuagint within the writings of Paul and the epistles, which, it follows that line of Hellenistic Judaism that accepts the Enochian text, because we find in the epistles it seems like the New Testament aligns more with the Enochian Judaism texts that come from Enoch, especially in the epistles and in Paul's theology, at least it seems like.
I agree with that.
That was more my point,
Yeah,
and
the
I
Enochian
didn't give the
literature, the
dichotomy of the two
extension
groups, so that was
literature.
my
I mean,
error. Go ahead.
Paul himself has, well, he says he knows of a man, and is generally thought to be a self-reference, who was
Mhm.
caught up into the levels of heaven and so forth. That is so, I mean, there are several ways, but that just strikingly stands out, that the Enoch literature and the ascension type literature is having an influence, insofar as it already exists at the time of Paul, it's having a direct and important influence on Paul. So there, I have to agree with you, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks for catching that, because I was oversimplifying and I wasn't thinking about because I know there's a group attached to the Essenes that was didn't they would have had a critique of the temple Sadducees as well. Um, but for me, the problem of Paul, and you just did a episode, I think, with another podcast where you talked about how the historical Jesus is without sans Paul, without Paul. Um, for me, the historical Jesus, when you really look at him, does align with the Ebionite Nazarene early view, a a Jesus without Paul, because you really don't have the Jesus of the New Testament or Christianity without Paul. And for those who want to look at whether you're looking at the quest for the historical Jesus or these different ones, one through line, I mean, they all agree on two things: the baptism and the resurrection are only two things we're clear on. The rest is hotly debated. Um, but the other thing is, majority of all the historical critical scholarship see Jesus as a Jewish reformer within Judaism, not seeking to create a new religion. And all of that for me aligns with the early Ebionite Nazarene views of a non-divine human prophet who is calling for the you know uh, purification of an impure temple. He was calling for a purification of the temple. Like the earliest Ebionite, that's what he was calling for. And then you have the messianic kingly aspirations to overthrow, which we have indications of. But I find that the historical Jesus, you don't need Paul. And I didn't get a chance to listen to. I saw that you had done that episode, but
Well, the
Paul
Christian,
is really a problem. Paul is what creates Christianity.
right. It was interesting that we did the discussion last night with a Christian, and he was laying out, non-Christian sources. He indicated the Talmud, but we were also talking about the correspondence between Pliny the Younger and the Emperor Trajan, Tacitus, his mention in the Annals, and Josephus, of course, which we all agreed were independent attestation to Jesus. But more than that, I think you're right that the what we call the Ebionites, there is no doubt in my mind that they believed in a more earthly, mortal Jesus, a Torah Orthodox Jesus, and that is where I think we have to look for the original Jesus movement. Jesus and his immediate followers are undoubtedly more like those Ebionites, no
Mhm.
doubt about it. And that Paul and our Greek New Testament authors, they're taking the Jesus movement in a whole new direction, using Greco-Roman philosophy, and having a distinctly pro-Roman political perspective. And that's sort of the elbow that Paul represents. He is using this messianic movement, this Torah Orthodox messianic movement started by Jesus, and turning it on its head, turning it inside out if necessary, just as he does with Hebrew scriptures in general. Paul is changing the Jesus movement. But it's that movement that gives us our Greek New Testament and what we call Christianity, which is, it seems to me, in many ways, the photographic negative of what the original must have looked like.
Mhm. You know, and that's another big smoking gun red flag for me is that Jesus spoke Aramaic and when in synagogue read in Hebrew. And we don't have like original Aramaic Hebrew Gospels. We have writings in Koine Greek. And so like there is a loss in translation when you study languages because I've studied Hebrew, Paleo Hebrew. I've done studies of Greek, and you understand there's nuances to words, and in translation there's always loss of translation. If you understand Hebrew words, the idioms have multiple meanings based upon context, and if you take one word and you translate it the exact same way through into English, you're gonna lose the nuance of how it in many times has multiple meanings, like the word chesed. Uh, you know, uh, you know, Various words they have multiple meanings, and the arbitrary nature of translation, you lose some of the nuance, and thus take out the original meaning, and so it's tough that we have these late copies. And me, I always get stuck on the physical evidence, and I really respect and appreciate the effort into understanding where it came from, and I agree that it's there. Not that it's not there; it is there. It's just that I need the earliest manuscript to accept it.
Well, we
I
keep finding, like I say, it was a remarkable
mm,
thing what we found
yeah.
in the middle of the 20th century, with the discovery of Nag Hammadi texts, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that has deeply enriched our understanding of the religion of the period, both Gnostic Christianity and pre-war sectarian Jewish messianic thought. That has been a huge thing. We're also continuously discovering new inscriptions, new physical evidence. So all we can do, my brother, is hope that that process continues and
Yeah.
that we keep getting more texts and more physical evidence, actual inscriptions and stuff that might help us at least give us clues to filling out this picture with greater certainty.
All right. So yeah, we've had a good conversation today, covered some really good points. Is there any final words that you would like to give before we sign off here?
No, thank you for this wonderful conversation. It really was yeah, fun and fascinating. So thank you, sir.
All right. Well, I want to thank for everybody for listening to the Pulling the Threads podcast. Please like, subscribe, and share this, and stay tuned for more episodes coming in the future.